Thank you very much for inviting me. It is indeed a pleasure, but it's also, of course, as the chair alluded to, that I'm a fish out of water. I'm an educated biologist, but have always sort of worked at the interface between comparative physiology, so the study of how animals function, and more medical physiology. And I see myself as somewhere in between those research fields. The reason that I'm interested in August Krogh is that he is believed to be the founder of comparative physiology. So when I was a student in the room where we had coffee, there was a picture, this picture in fact, hanging on the wall, and he was always spoken about as the founder of comparative physiology. I then went to my first American Physiological Society meeting quite a few years ago, and it was the year when Novo had initiated the Krogh lecture and was given to his daughter, Bodil Schmidt-Nielsen. But I went to different talks, and it was quite apparent that in the exercise field, Krogh was viewed as the founder. In capillary physiology, Krogh was seen as the founder of the field. And within respiratory physiology, Krogh was seen as the founder. So it sort of dawned on me that perhaps he was not just a comparative physiologist. And what I will try to do today is to give you a sense of, I think, the most illustrious career of any physiologist. And I don't think that I am overestimating his importance by saying that he is probably the biggest scientist that Denmark has ever produced. We know him, of course, from insulin, and that is what we're celebrating today, that he brought insulin back to Denmark. I will not talk about that at all, because scientifically, that was probably not very important in his career. He never published on endocrinology as such, except for these tests that were mentioned in the talk before. He came from not a poor family, but a family in Grenaa, which, just like Brande, was not a very big city. It still is not a big city. I actually gave a talk about August Krogh there 2 days ago. It's a tiny city, and it was very, very small when Krogh was born in the 1870s. His father was a brewer and a shipbuilder, and you can see little August sitting here on his father's lap. Viggo was the father, and here's the family where August Krogh is sitting on the right, so the 10-year-old boy. And when I saw the picture the first time, I was sure it was August Krogh sitting on the left, but that was his father. And I actually met August Krogh's grandson, and he looked exactly the same. And I thought it was August Krogh walking in the door. So it was really weird. So I think sort of these tall guys with these penetrative eyes, and then the characteristic beard, which I think they must comb themselves, is something that runs in the family. Well, August Krogh then was a school student in Grenaa, obviously. He went to Aarhus for high school. That was what you had to do at the time, so he had to live in Aarhus. And there is this plaque hanging at the Katedralskole in Aarhus that I passed every day as a boy. So Krogh was always this sort of person that I had an idea about, or wanted to find out who he was. And this is a picture of the young man just when he finished his high school and became student. Part of his interest, or a lot of his interest in science, was given through William Sørensen. William Sørensen was a very interesting Danish biologist who fought with just about everybody. He was considered an enfant terrible. He was always fighting people with their ideas. He believed in evolution, which many people didn't. He would point to the errors that other people committed, and he had showed no mercy when he could demonstrate that they were wrong. So he was not a very likable, or he was not very liked, but he was a very interesting and probably actually very likable person. He was a member of the Royal Society, and this is Krogh's picture that hangs in the Royal Society in the center of Copenhagen. And you can see that they have placed him in the back here, so it almost looks like a Goya painting with William Sørensen sitting down there. So he was an interesting person. But what he would do would be to take the young August Krogh out on trips and show him nature, and they would collect animals, they would make microscopes and so forth, and look at animals, and he would tell them about how animals lived in the wild. But when Krogh then came to Copenhagen to study biology, William Sørensen also said that you have to go and see the lectures given by Christian Bohr, Niels Bohr's father. Christian Bohr had assumed the chair in physiology in 1885 after Panum died. And he really, much more than Panum, brought experimental physiology, the experimental approach, into medicine. And I think in many ways you could say that he created what was experimental medicine in Denmark. He had trained with Panum and succeeded Panum, but he had also trained with Ludwig in Germany, just like Panum had. So he brought sort of Ludwig's way of thinking, which is this very experimental approach, basing physiology in quantitative models, in chemistry, and in physics, that we can describe the world with sensible explanations, but also a tradition of looking at a number of different animals. As a comparative physiologist, I think it's really important to stress the fact that medicine is built on intelligent choices of animal models. And what Bohr did was that he studied birds that would be diving at the Faroe Islands. He studied frogs that became the topic of Aarhus Krogh's thesis. He studied how metabolism changes when animals hatch from the eggs. He did that in warm-blooded animals and cold-blooded animals. And he looked at the oxygen levels in the swim bladder of fish and actually exploited that there are lots of different animals that do fascinating things that we can learn from. Now we are so tied in to specific models in a matter of convenience, and I think very, very often we fall into what you could call the mousetrap. Bohr was also a true Renaissance man and a more than just a scientist. This picture was given to Niels Bohr when he got when he took over as chair of the Carlsberg Foundation and therefore got the nice house out at Carlsberg. And it was given to him by the daughter of the physicist up here, Christiansen. And she had actually worked with Haldane and came up with the Haldane effect. She's first author on that paper. But she was the daughter and would be playing under the table here when the four F's were meeting for dinner every Thursday. So it was the physiologist, it was the philosopher, it was the physicist, and it was the philologist. And those four people representing the four areas that are worthwhile in life would sit together and discuss sort of big problems. And it is said that Christian Bohr would be able to recite Goethe in German. And this was a time when people were academics, not the kind of work that goes on at modern universities. Krogh then went to the lecture of Bohr, and the first lecture Bohr gave was on how our gases moved from the air into the lungs and into the blood. There he used mathematical models or mathematical expressions of physical processes of diffusion, active transport, solubilities, penetrance coefficients, and so forth. And Krogh was absolutely thrilled. He was utterly fascinated and immediately decided that he wanted to do his thesis with Bohr. He was invited into Bohr's lab, and this is one of the very few pictures that exist of him at the time, and you can sort of see he's a serious guy doing experiments early on in the lab. And what was absolutely extraordinary about Krogh was that he would develop lots of equipment himself very, very early on. So this was as an undergraduate student, he would start to make these types of experimental settings where he would say, well, if I set up things that way or the other, I can make measurements of this, that, and the other, mostly gases at the time. He relied on what he would later call visual thinking, where he described that he would be lying in bed either before sleeping or when waking up, and then he would lie with closed eyes and he would envision how should this equipment be set up, how would it work? And he said that he would never start constructing it until he had thought it all through and knew exactly how it should work. And it would normally work in the first go. Now, among those things that he did there was that he developed what's called a tonometer, where he could take very, very small blood samples, equilibrate them with a much smaller air bubble, and then he could take that air bubble out and analyze how much oxygen and CO2 there was in there. That provided the first construction of an S-shaped oxygen dissociation curve. They were linear up until 1904. It also provided for the measurements of the influence of CO2, which is now known as the Bohr effect. So there was one paper where Krogh was single author, where he describes the method, and then there's a second paper in the same issue of ACTA showing the influence of CO2, what we now know as the Bohr effect, where Bohr is the first author, Hasselbalch, who came up with the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, together with Henderson, is the second author, and Krogh is the third author. This was in 1904, just at the same time as Krogh was defending his thesis, where he looked at gas exchange across the skin and lung in frogs, and conclude that there is an active transport of oxygen across the lungs, which I'll get back to in a second. Now, apart from having done what what is textbook material as an undergraduate student, he also went to Greenland in the summer of 1902, at the time when he was finishing his thesis, got interested in atmospheric CO2 levels, make very precise measurements of CO2 in Greenland, can demonstrate that CO2 in the air is always and consistently higher in air than in water, saying that there must be a production of CO2 all the time that is being absorbed by the water. He's one of the first people who takes the absorption of CO2 into the water into account. And he then makes these calculations where he says, well, how much coal are we burning a year? And does that influence how much CO2 is in the atmosphere? And then he ends up with that at current rates, which is 120 years ago, it will not lead to global warming. But little did he know, of course, that our burning of fossil fuels will increase dramatically, as it did, and is now the cause of global warming. So he was a man of many talents that would always sort of look for new problems wherever he was. And then he also, together with Wilhelm Mohr, translated Steno from Latin to Danish. I asked some of the hosts yesterday, why is it that all of the institutes that are funded by Novo are called Steno Institutes? Nobody seemed to know the answer. I don't know the answer either, but I think it must be a homage to Krogh, because he was utterly fascinated by Steno and translated him. So I think this is actually the background. Well, I said to you that Krogh concluded in his PhD that oxygen is secreted actively across the lungs. And those of you who remember any respiratory physiology would know that that is certainly not the way we look at oxygen movement. Today we know that it passes purely by diffusion. But at the time, Bohr was convinced that there was an active mechanism, so that there was something active sitting in the epithelium in the lungs that would take the oxygen from the air and transport it into the blood. He had a number of very good reasons to believe this, and I've listed some of the 6 key arguments. The problem is that all of those resided in errors, in experimental errors, because the air bubbles that Bohr used to equilibrate the blood were too large. They never reached equilibrium. And with Krogh's new experiments, he could demonstrate that that was not the case. So Bohr put his student on to solving the problem of oxygen secretion, for which Bohr had been nominated to the Nobel Prize 3 times. Krogh demonstrates that it is not true and publishes 7 papers together with his wife Marie Krogh in Skandinavische Arkiv für Physiologie, which is now Acta Physiologica. They would later call these the 7 little devils, because these papers demonstrate one after the other where Bohr went wrong, and demonstrates that oxygen moves by diffusion and diffusion alone. Period. That was the ending sentence of the 7 papers. It starts out relatively nicely saying that we will now demonstrate that my teacher is wrong. And then he basically demonstrates that, and Bohr died the following year from a cerebral hemorrhage. Krogh has now established himself as a scientist, you could say. I actually think that those 7 little devils would have been worthwhile a Nobel Prize at the time. he get a permanent position. He now establishes a lab in Ny Vestergade, just in front of Nationalmuseet, and this is where he lives with his family or establishes his family. He's married to Marie Krogh, one of the first medical doctors, or female medical doctors, I should say. They have these 4 children. And Krogh does these fantastic things where his first child is born too early and has difficulties maintaining temperature. So he creates a temperature cabinet where little Erik was lying for weeks, and he probably saved his life. I mean, Krogh was an extraordinary person in the sense that whenever he encountered a problem, whether it was within his own life or somewhere else, he would immediately analyze it and find a solution and do something about it. There was a very, very short way to action. Now in Ny Vestergade, he met Lindhardt. Lindhardt came to see Krogh because Lindhardt was going to Greenland, knew that Krogh had been there, and Lindhardt had just been appointed as a professor to Copenhagen University to study exercise, or gymnastics, we should say. So it was not really exercise, and gymnastics was hardly an academic field at the time. I said that sometime, and then I got a lot of flag for that. But it really wasn't a science at the time, and it took a while before it became one. But together they designed this exercise bike that we still use in teaching, but it is an extraordinary bike because what they do is that they measure very, very precisely the amount of work that the experimental person is performing. They can measure the weight or the mass of the person. They can measure gas exchange. And therefore, so from there, they can now calculate using the respiratory quotient. They can calculate what is the fuel that is being used, how much energy is actually transformed into work, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And they publish a series of papers that really are the first sort of you could say, detailed descriptions of the physiological response to exercise. You can see that there's quite often only 1 or 2 or 3, 4 graphs, and that's because there were 3, 4 experimental subjects: Aarhus Krogh, Lindhardt, Marie Krogh, and then the 14-year-old boy who delivered groceries from the local store in the afternoon. So they had 1 female, 2 old guys, and a young one. What they show very, very nicely also, and you can see that the picture here, is the immediate response that takes place upon the start of exercise. And they notice this and they start to speculate what are the reasons for this very fast rise in heart rate and ventilation. And they speculate that it is what's called cortical irradiation, meaning that when we start, or when we initiate our skeletal muscle contractions through the cortex, then we also send feed-forward signals to the brainstem and therefore start to increase our cardiorespiratory performance, a theory that we still subside to today and that has received a lot of traction, but is here the interpretation of really, really good data. Krogh goes in and then he builds a model of the heart, where he can change the venous return. 50 years before Arthur Guyton, he says, well, what really determines the amount of blood that the heart is pumping is the rate at which it is delivered through the veins. Arthur Guyton made a long career out of this, never cited Krogh. Marie Krogh was involved. She was also a co-author on some of the papers of the 7 Little Devils. She developed a method to look at the oxygen diffusive capacity of the lungs using carbon monoxide, a method that is still used. And on the basis of this, she defended her doctoral thesis. And you can see here a picture. There was drawings that was quite common at the time. And you can see it's Professor Bock. He was a student of Bohr, but also collaborated with Krogh and was involved in the role of venous return. So at this time, Krogh has sorted out how does the lungs work. He has sorted out the problems of how the heart works in exercise, and he starts to think about how do the capillaries, the small vessels in the skeletal muscles, how do they deliver the oxygen. And he describes himself that he is sitting at the library, the beautiful library at Copenhagen University, and he gets the idea of the opening and closing of capillaries. The idea being that whenever the muscle is working and needs more oxygen, by opening more capillaries, we now reduce the distance between the capillary and the mitochondria. Well, mitochondria were not known at the time, but where the oxygen is being utilized, and therefore enabling the oxygen to diffuse easier into the tissues. He takes that idea back to Marie, discusses it, and she approves of it. And I think it demonstrates this companionship that they really had, that they were living a life together in science, and they were discussing science all the time. And she had a tremendous influence, not only on his science, but I think she also kept his personality in check at times. We'll get to that at the very end of the talk. He goes out, and this is where I think is what demonstrates his absolute genius. So he has this idea, and what he then does is that he says, well, if I go out and take a fish, a frog, a horse, a dog, and a guinea pig, those are the animals that he could buy at the market, I guess. And then he looks at how many capillaries are there, and how does that relate to the metabolism? Because here he is comparing ectothermic animals with low metabolism with endothermic animals with high metabolism. He's comparing a large animal, the horse, with a low metabolism per mass, with a small animal, the guinea pig, that's a high metabolic rate. And what he demonstrates, if you just let your eyes sort of glaze over the values, then he demonstrates that the number of capillaries, so the machinery or the anatomy to deliver the oxygen, is directly proportional to the need for oxygen. So he takes this comparative view and says, by looking at the differences, he identifies what is the unifying theme. And I think that is a true goal of comparative physiology. And it's the first time in history that I know of that anybody does it. He sets up a mathematical model. He contacts Erlang. The older people in the audience will know him from the tables that we used to have in high schools. But Erlang then sets up the equation that you can see on the right, and they basically use a mathematical model to describe a physiological system. I think, again, it is the first time ever that a mathematical model is directly applied to a physiological question. This is, of course, completely normal nowadays, but it was not normal 100 years ago. Krogh gets the Nobel Prize. This is the picture that is supposedly taken on the evening where he has received it. I think it may have been taken the evening after, but he's sitting here with a letter from the Nobel Committee in his nice suit, because there was a party at the University of Copenhagen where he ran out when he knew that he had been given the prize, and then he went back to investigate and sat there quietly. With the Nobel Prize, they established the Rockefeller building together with Niels Bohr. And then there's Hevesy that is on the left. And Hevesy had come to work with Niels Bohr, so Christian Bohr's son, and had with him brought radioactive material, so what is called isotopes, and among those was deuterium or radioactive water, you could say, which now enabled that Krogh could study how do water and salts cross biological membranes, because the fluxes are often so high that by adding it on one side of the membrane or the inside or outside the cells, you cannot study the actual direction of the transport. You can only study the net transport. So now for the first time it's possible to study how do water and salts actually cross the membranes. He starts out with frogs, does this experiment where he takes frogs and keep them in very, very low salinity, so he and fasting deprive them of salts so that they are missing salts, and then he adds them into water and can demonstrate that by adding slight amounts of salt into that water, that there is now an active uptake of salts into the animal. First time ever that it is a distinguished, or that the active and the passive transports of salts are distinguished, and he comes up with the concept of active transport. It is ironic that this is where he killed the ideas of his supervisor. With the active transport of oxygen in the lungs, he demonstrated it by diffusion alone, and then 25 years later, he demonstrated for the first time that ions are transported actively. It of course leads to the fantastic momentum that we have in Denmark. Skogh's Nobel Prize for the sodium-potassium pump is built on this. All of Ussing's work on the more sophisticated aspects of electrochemical gradients is built on Krogh's work. And he writes a small article in Science where he says the use of isotopes, the first time that isotopes are used. Now I said that I think Marie Krogh played an important role not only as a scientist, but also keeping him quiet, I guess, to some extent. Marie Krogh died a few years before Krogh, and part of his, you could say, willingness for combat is evident in this letter that he sent to the Royal Society, where Niels Bohr at the time was president. It's a long letter. It's 4 pages, and I've only taken part of it. But those of you who are in the Danish can just read it. But he basically says that he wants to retract from the Royal Society. He gives a list of reasons that they don't support young people, that they need to support the establishment of a research council. It's an incredibly well-formulated letter. And he, at the same time, contacts the press. There's lots of newspaper articles, and it attracts a lot of attention. The Royal Society does not know what to do, because it turns out that there's no possibility of not being a member. You cannot be excluded, and you cannot resign. So there is no way of getting out of the society. So they write, and this is Niels Bohr's assistant, of course, or secretary, who just says that we have received your letter and we will be considering it. Fortunately, we could say for this story, Krogh died before they actually reached a consensus on how to deal with it, because it really was not possible to grant him the wish, but they deleted his name from the member list, so I think a compromise was struck. But in the last years of Krogh's life, he made his laboratory in the basement where he lived, and he went back to study comparative physiology. He had, for his entire career, he had been interested in insects and sort of peculiar adaptations. And he sets up this carousel with locusts that are flying around, and he then measures their individual metabolic rates. He measures their respiratory quotient so he can see whether they burn glucose or fat. And he does this in part because he's interested in solving the problem of locusts being this sort of predatory animal in Africa. He also writes in one of his papers about these locusts. And I think this is important in terms of understanding what drives a scientist. I want to say a word for the study of comparative physiology also for its own sake. You will find in the lower animals mechanisms and adaptations of exquisite beauty and of the most surprising character. And I think nothing can be more fascinating than the senses and instinct of insects as revealed by the modern investigations. I find this quote important because it is also this desire to understand the world, not because it has to be used for something directly necessarily, but because it makes us better people to think. It makes us better people to understand the world we live in. He would, in his entire career, so this is the bookshelf in my office with my Krogh collection, which you can hear I'm completely obsessed about the guy. But what he did is that every 10 years he would write a monograph about the lung gases problem, the osmotic problems. So he would, for every time he had solved a problem, the capillaries for which he got the Nobel Prize, well, he would write a monograph where he would summarize all of the existing literature and point forward to what had to be known. And these books, even though they're 100 years old, they are amazingly sharp. And there are lots of experiments or problems that he addresses that remains to be solved. So what was it that made him so incredibly good? Obviously, he was very, very bright. There's no doubt about that. He must also have been very, very devoted. He worked very, very hard. He had this ability of visual thinking, which I think very few people are endowed with. He had the ability to produce the equipment needed. But he also, I think, had this way of identifying an area that needed to be solved. In doing so, identifying what are the experiments that need to be performed, creating the equipment needed to solve that, and then when having solved it, saying, okay, I'm done, I'm going to move to the next set of questions. I think what we tend to do, most of us, is that we find a technique that we like and then we squeeze it for the next 20 years. But he certainly did not do that. He basically always looked ahead. I think the older I get, the more I admire that ability. His daughter went on to United States and became the first female president of the American Physiological Society, played a very, very big role within kidney physiology and in comparative physiology. And yes, he brought insulin to Denmark, but he did a lot more. Thank you.
Can't help but feeling dwarfed by scientists like Krogh. And just as a thought experiment, if a scientist like that appeared in your group today, would you believe that it's possible to excel to the same level, or was it because there were simply so many discoveries to be made at that time that it's not possible these days?
I think it's an excellent question, and we actually celebrate his Nobel Prize in 2 weeks at Katedralskolen School in Aarhus with the students there. And I have been thinking about how to answer that question, and I don't know what the answer is. I think that definitely is that he came at the right time when there was so. I mean, he could sort of skim the big discoveries. So he was there in the right time. But I think if you look at many of the very good scientists today, it is also characteristic that they don't dwell in the same area, that you move on and that you allow yourself to develop throughout your career. But what would he have been today? Would he have been a molecular biologist? Would he have, what would he have? I don't know what would he have been a neurophysiologist? The brain is the biggest frontier now, isn't it, of unknown physiology.